The first frost of autumn always arrives quietly in the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia, settling over the apple trees like a held breath. But on this particular October morning, something stranger than frost had gathered along the fence line of Carter family orchard. Trucks slowed on the county road. Drivers leaned out their windows, squinting. Some laughed. Some just shook their heads, because there, moving beneath 80-year-old apple trees heavy with fruit, was a widow in an olive canvas jacket, opening the gate to release 43 chickens into her orchard. On purpose. "She's lost it," one neighbor muttered to another at the feed store that afternoon. "Turned a real orchard into a barnyard." They didn't know what Emily Carter knew. They didn't know what her husband's notebook had started to reveal, and they had no idea that within 2 years, the same insects destroying their crops would all but vanish from hers. If you've ever watched something everyone laughed at quietly prove them wrong, stay with this one. And if you've ever lost someone and had to rebuild something they loved, you already know exactly how heavy Emily's mornings were. Emily Carter was 41 years old when her husband Daniel collapsed in the orchard rows during the peak of harvest season, a bushel basket still in his hands. The heart attack took him in minutes. It left her, 6 months later, standing alone in an apple orchard that had belonged to his family for nearly 80 years. 12 acres of heirloom trees, a farmhouse that echoed too loud in the evenings, and a business that was quietly dying long before Daniel did. She kept his field journal, cracked leather cover, corners soft from decades in back pockets. She carried it everywhere now, not out of sentiment alone, but because it was the only thing that still made sense to her. Dates, weather, yields, all written in his blocky handwriting that trailed off into her own thinner script somewhere around page 40. The orchard had been declining for years before Daniel passed. Codling moths bored into the fruit. Apple maggots turned crisp heirlooms into soft, wormy disappointments. Japanese beetles stripped the leaves bare by midsummer. Every year, the pesticide truck came more often, and every year it worked a little less. The insects were winning, and they were winning smarter. Emily sat at the kitchen table some nights, with the farm's books spread in front of her, chemical costs climbing, yields falling, and felt something she rarely let herself feel, the quiet fear that she might be the one who finally lost the orchard her husband's grandfather had planted. If you've ever inherited something you were terrified of failing, a business, a family, a name, you already know this feeling in your chest. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever been in Emily's shoes. It was Walter Hensley who changed things, though he'd be the last to take credit for it. Walter was 78, a retired county extension specialist who'd spent 40 years walking orchards up and down the valley. He'd known Daniel since he was a boy. After the funeral, he started stopping by. Not to fix anything, just to walk the rows, with Emily on Sunday mornings, coffee in hand, saying very little. One such morning, as the two of them walked past a stand of untended trees near the tree line, Walter stopped and pointed at a flurry of wild birds working the fallen fruit beneath the branches. "Look at that," he said. "Those birds have been hunting insects in this orchard since before you were born." Emily said nothing. Walter turned to her, his eyes calm behind wire-rimmed glasses. "If wild birds spend all day hunting insects here," he said, "why are your workers spraying the insects instead of letting nature help?" He didn't explain further. He never did. That was Walter's way. Plant a question and let it grow on its own time. The same way he'd let an orchard tell him what it needed instead of the other way around. Emily thought about that question for weeks. She started reading old agricultural bulletins from decades past, forgotten accounts of orchardists who once ran poultry beneath their trees, not as a novelty, but as a working system. Chickens scratching through fallen fruit, eating overwintering larvae before they could complete their life cycle, consuming beetles, grasshoppers, caterpillars, even ticks. turning weed seeds into nothing, leaving manure behind as free fertilizer. It sounded almost too simple. That was what worried her most. In early spring, Emily bought 43 pullets, mostly Rhode Island Reds and Buff Orpingtons, chosen for their calm temperaments and relentless foraging instincts. She built lightweight mobile fencing and small portable shelters she could drag between orchard blocks, rotating the flock so no single section of ground took too much pressure. The reaction from the neighboring farms was immediate. Trucks slowed at the fence line. A few orchard owners laughed openly at the co-op meeting. "Chickens won't save an orchard," one said. "They'll just tear up your irrigation lines and peck your fruit before you even harvest it." Emily didn't argue. She just wrote it down in the notebook, the way Daniel would have. Skeptics many, evidence none yet. Continue. The first season was not a triumph. It was, honestly, a mess. A gate blew open in a spring storm, and 11 chickens escaped into the neighbor's hayfield, taking 2 full days to round up. A fox found the flock's weak point in the fencing and picked off 6 birds before Emily reinforced the perimeter with electric netting. Heavy rains turned one rotation block into a mud pit that took weeks to recover. In the section she left the flock too long, the ground turned bare and overgrazed, and she had to reseed it by hand. And through it all, some fruit still came in with insect damage. Not everything was solved. Not even close. The laughter at the feed store got louder that summer, but Emily kept writing. Dates, weather, which block, how many days, how many birds. Codling moth counts in the drop fruit. Beetle damage per tree. Soil moisture, what worked, what didn't. Nothing relied on memory anymore. Everything depended on evidence, the same discipline Daniel had used for 20 years, now carrying her through a season that felt, more than once, like a very expensive mistake. This is usually the part people give up. If you've ever pushed through a season like this, in farming, in a business, in anything worth doing, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because the real turning point is coming. The second season told a different story, though it revealed itself slowly, in small numbers, rather than sudden miracles. Emily started noticing fewer larvae in the fallen apples she cut open each week. Japanese beetle damage on the leaves declined block by block, following the flock's rotation almost exactly. The grass beneath the trees grew thicker and greener, no longer choked by weeds, enriched instead by manure the chickens left behind as they worked. Earthworm counts in her soil samples rose. Ladybugs returned in numbers she hadn't seen in years. Wild songbirds, once occasional visitors, became a constant presence, working alongside the chickens, as if the orchard had quietly become a food source again instead of a chemical battlefield. None of it happened overnight. Emily was careful to remind herself of that, writing it plainly in the notebook. No miracles, only decisions, repeated. Then came the test that nearly broke her resolve. An unusually warm spring triggered an explosion of insect populations across the entire valley. Neighboring orchards responded the only way they knew how, spraying harder, spraying more often. Emily's own workers asked if she wanted to do the same. She didn't. Instead, she adjusted her rotation, moved the flock through the worst-hit blocks more frequently, and trusted the system she and Walter and 2 seasons of evidence had built. For weeks, she genuinely didn't know if she'd made a terrible mistake. By late summer, the answer arrived, not with fanfare, but with numbers she could finally trust. Insect damage across the orchard had dropped sharply compared to the year before. Chemical costs, once her heaviest expense, fell by more than half. Her workers spent their days harvesting instead of spraying. The apples themselves looked different, cleaner, glossier, free of the wormholes that had haunted every season since the infestations began. At the farmer's market that fall, customers noticed before Emily even said a word. The fruit smelled different. tasted different. Word spread through the small stalls faster than she expected. The moment that stayed with her longest came on an ordinary Tuesday, when one of the loudest skeptics from the co-op meetings, a neighboring orchard owner who'd come specifically expecting to find her mistake, walked the rows beside her instead. He stopped near a cluster of trees, knelt down without a word, and watched the chickens scratching methodically through the fallen fruit, consuming the larvae before they could ever become next year's moths. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Emily didn't either. When she finally spoke, it wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, almost to herself as much as to him. Nature was already doing the work, she said. I just stopped getting in its way. What happened next spread further than Emily ever expected. A few neighboring orchards began experimenting with their own small rotational flocks, borrowing fencing designs from Emily's setup and asking for pages photocopied straight from her notebook. The county extension office, the same one Walter had retired from, began hosting demonstration days at Carter Family Orchard, walking local growers through 2 full seasons of recorded data. School groups came to see the chickens working beneath the trees and learn, for the first time, what regenerative agriculture actually looked like on a real, working farm. Researchers took an interest in the notebook itself, not because it contained anything revolutionary, but because it contained something rare. 2 years of unbroken, honest observation, failures included, written by hand by a woman who refused to guess when she could measure instead. Walter never took credit. When people mentioned the chickens, he'd just shrug and say Emily did the work. He'd only asked one question. The greatest harvest Emily brought in that year wasn't measured in bushels, though those numbers had improved too. It was something harder to weigh. A renewed relationship between the trees, the soil, the birds, and a woman who had once stood alone in a quiet farmhouse, wondering if she could hold on to what her husband loved. She hadn't beaten the insects with force. She'd stopped fighting the orchard and started listening to it. One season, one notebook page, one small decision at a time. And somewhere beneath those apple trees, 43 chickens were still working every morning, doing exactly what nature had been quietly waiting to do all along. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. We bring you a new one every week. Real farming stories with real heart behind them. And we want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from tonight? And have you ever been in a situation like Emily's, where everyone doubted you until the evidence finally spoke for itself? Tell us below.